Hi everyone, it's Rehman here, the Member of Parliament for Gillingham and Rainham. In today's episode of In Conversation with Rehman Chishti, with policymakers and experts, I'll be discussing the recent announcement of the United States and NATO of their troop withdrawal from Afghanistan and how that affects the United Kingdom and the international community in their security. And today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Sir Mark Lyall Grant, who is one of the United Kingdom's former top diplomats. Having served as the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor, the United Kingdom's Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the United Nations, and the UK High Commissioner to Pakistan, which at the time was the United Kingdom's largest diplomatic mission in the world. And of course, I think many would agree with me that Sir Mark is in a unique position to answer some of those questions that are on individuals' minds around the world as we, the international community, the NATO, and its partners look to withdraw troop withdrawal from Afghanistan in September 2021. So Mark, great to have you with us today.
Well, it's great to be here, Ray. Thank you.
So Mark, can I just kickstart with the first question to outline for the viewers the background, so that the viewers can get a context of why we are where we are today. We need to look at the background as to what led the UK, the US, and the NATO to go into Afghanistan in the first place in 2001. Different people have different reasons for why the UK went in, from a human rights perspective to a national security perspective. But can you clarify why the UK, US, and NATO forces went into Afghanistan in the first place?
Well, the origin of that is the attacks by Al-Qaeda on 9/11/2001, so the 11th of September 2001, on New York and Washington. Now, those attacks were launched by Al-Qaeda, which was led by Osama bin Laden. And at that time, in 2001, Al-Qaeda was based largely in Afghanistan. And Afghanistan was run by a Taliban government, which was not itself a terrorist government or anything, but it was quite an extreme Islamist government, which was only recognized by three other countries in the world. So as a result of that attack, the Americans riposted and wanted to eliminate Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda as a threat to the West. And that was the origin of the attacks that started on Afghanistan. First, there were bombing raids targeting on Osama bin Laden and the leadership of Al-Qaeda. And then there was a NATO force that went into Afghanistan. So the aim was a counterterrorism one, to both punish Al-Qaeda for having launched those 9/11 attacks, but also as a deterrent to prevent them having the capacity to launch attacks against Western democracies beyond that. And it was actually the first time that NATO, in 75 years of its existence, has invoked Article 5. And some of your listeners will know that Article 5 of the NATO treaty says that if one of the members is attacked, then all have a responsibility to respond. And America triggered that. America had been attacked and NATO responded together. So then there were up to around 25 different countries, mainly NATO countries, but not exclusively, who went in to Afghanistan. And that was the origin of the troops there. Over the years, the numbers have varied hugely. There was more than 100,000 American troops at one point in 2010, 2011. They've now been gradually drawn down as Al-Qaeda has been defeated. And there's about just under 10,000 NATO troops left there today, 20 years later.
And can I just clarify then, so that we're very, very clear, the origins of the United States, the UK, and NATO for going into Afghanistan in the first place, was squarely and purely for a national security perspective, because the government in Afghanistan, the Taliban government, which was recognized by Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, was felt to be harboring a terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. So it was, after 9/11, the aim of that mission was a national security, international security, national security for the US to take out that terrorist organization. Would I be right in that?
Absolutely, that is absolutely correct. It wasn't to take out the Taliban government, although no one liked the Taliban government. That was the consequence of it. The Taliban were driven out, but that was not the aim of the intervention in 2001. No.
And then can I just put this quote to you from the Chief of the Defence Staff, General Sir Nick Carter, who said this recently. In the last 20 years, there has been no international terrorist attack mounted from Afghanistan. I think that is a great tribute to our armed forces and, of course, to the armed forces of NATO countries that have been committed to this. So with that being the case, would you then say that the mission by the US, UK and NATO has achieved its clear objectives?
I think it has partly achieved it. I mean, I wouldn't be quite as clear-cut as General Carter was, because the number of terrorist attacks, including in the UK, did have links back to the Afghan-Pakistan border. For instance, some of the failed attacks in 2005, other attacks that have happened in the UK, for instance, the 7/7, as it's called, the bombs that took place in London, that actually did have some links back to the Afghanistan-Pakistan border areas. But in general terms, it is true that Al-Qaeda has been very heavily degraded as a result of Western efforts in Afghanistan. Not completely eliminated, but nonetheless, the leadership obviously has been killed, and they're not able to launch the sort of attacks that they were launching before that. So that is, in that sense, it's been successful.
And can I just ask a clarification on that? And with regards to what you've just said, is that there has still been incidents around the world which can be linked back to what was going on in Afghanistan-Pakistan border. And with that being the case, in 2014, we've seen a statement by the president of Afghanistan who said 130,000 US and NATO forces withdrew from Afghanistan. And that was in 2014. So if we were still, the international community, getting incidents around the world which were coming in from that area, Afghanistan-Pakistan border, with a large NATO-US force in the region, how do you see that, moving forward when the number of international troops in Afghanistan would be very small? The topic we're coming to shortly with regards to the announcement by President Biden.
Well, I think it's fair to say that although I've explained the original reasons for the intervention in Afghanistan was counterterrorism, that over the years, the mission of the Western intervention has evolved and has changed over the time. So there was a desire to do more state building, to improve the lot of ordinary Afghans, to make the government more stable, more democratic, to improve women's rights, girls' rights to education, etc. So I think there was an agenda, particularly perhaps under the Clinton administration, which went a little bit further than the original aim. And I think those aims have not been fully achieved in Afghanistan. And once withdrawal happens, I doubt that many of those advances will be sustainable.
And just coming back to that very point is, of course, there's others, and I'll put to you later on the points made by the Ambassador Khalizad, who represents the United States covering Afghanistan, his recent appearance before the US Foreign Affairs Committee on this very point with regards to the rebuilding of Afghanistan and the issue of human rights in that country as we move forward. But can I just come back to the point? So international community, the US, the UK, NATO first went into Afghanistan 2001 purely from a security perspective. Now, 20 years down the line, we now have a statement by President Biden with regards to the withdrawal of the remaining US troops in Afghanistan. And he set a date for September 2021. Can I ask you this? Do you think that date being set is the right thing to do? And do you think, having now set that date, that would undermine all the work that has been done to address the security threat? Or do you think that would lead to potential further civil war and chaos in Afghanistan in years to come?
Well, it's not an easy question to ask because we're looking into a crystal ball here. I think there's a number of factors in play. There has been two levels of a peace process over the last couple of years. So one level is that the Americans have been talking directly to the Taliban, and they reached agreement in February 2020. And the agreement was that the Americans would withdraw their troops by May 2021. And in exchange for that, the Taliban agreed to three things. One, they would not attack foreign troops in the intervening period. Secondly, that they would cut all their links with terrorist groups, not just Al-Qaeda, but also Islamic State, ISIS, which has moved from Syria and Iraq, partly at least into Afghanistan as well. And thirdly, that they would start a dialogue with the government. Now, that agreement, I think, has been broken. I mean, essentially, you could say on both sides, because the Americans are not withdrawing in May this month. They're waiting till September. And equally, although it is true that the Taliban have not attacked foreign troops over the last 12 months, they haven't really cut their links with terrorists, as far as we know, and the negotiations between the government in Kabul, led by Ashraf Ghani, and the Taliban have not really taken off. And that is the second layer of the negotiations. And what the Americans are hoping is that this announcement, as well as satisfying a political demand domestically that they withdraw troops after 20 years, which is America's longest war, longer than the First World War, longer than their involvement in the Second World War, longer than Vietnam, the Korean War. So this is the longest war that America's been involved in. There is a demand and a majority of people who want American troops to be withdrawn. So obviously he's responding to that domestic political pressure, but he also hopes that it will generate a more active discussions between the Taliban and the existing Kabul government, which means that there won't be chaos when all the troops leave in September. I think it's fair to say that there are a number of other NATO countries, including probably the United Kingdom, that would have preferred America not to be setting this arbitrary deadline for withdrawal, because once the American troops withdraw, in practice, all NATO troops will have to withdraw, except for a very few left behind to protect the embassies of the different countries. And I think if it was Britain's decision, probably we would leave enough troops there to stabilize the government to prevent any potential Taliban takeover. So the question now is, what happens next?
Can I just clarify a couple of things with you on that, Sir Mark? One is with regards to the peace process and the peace talks. Neighbouring countries like Pakistan, I understand, have made it very clear that they want an orderly withdrawal of troops in line with progress and agreements in the peace process. But just looking at the comments recently in the media, the Diplomatic magazine in February 2021 has stated that the US-led peace process deal agreed on the 29th of February 2020 has not so far yielded much success in limiting violence within the country, and was followed by a resurgence in violence on the part of the Taliban, including against civilians. And the talks in Doha following the US-Taliban peace deal have been extremely slow. So with that being the case, and also I understand that in April, there's supposed to be talks with further talks, Washington-backed Afghan peace conference in Turkey, where the Taliban did not turn up. So how can we certain that the peace process and the talks will yield anything, or just simply a delaying tactic to get to September and then have anarchy in Afghanistan after that?
Well, I think that's actually a realistic scenario. I think originally, for many years, NATO has said that their withdrawal will be conditions-based. The reality is it's now date-based, if you like. So now that the decision has been taken, yes, there will be an incentive on the part of the government to negotiate with the Taliban so that there isn't anarchy after Western troops leave. But equally, there is some hope and indeed a certain expectation that the Taliban will want to participate in government or even take over the government in Kabul in a way that they have some chance of international recognition. Because it's one thing for the Taliban to take over the government in Kabul, which I'm sure they could do militarily once the Western troops have left. But if they're not going to be recognized by any other government, or maybe just the three governments that initially recognized them in 1996, then I don't think they will consider that to have been a success. So I think it's fair to say that Joe Biden, as president of the United States, is hoping that things will turn out better, but there must be a risk that it will turn out a lot worse.
And can I just clarify that very point with you and put some quotes to you? One is from Lindsey Graham, the US Senator, who has said a full withdrawal from Afghanistan is dumber than dirt and devilishly dangerous. President Biden will have, in essence, cancelled an insurance policy against another 9/11. Then we have a quote from William Burns, director of the CIA, who stated on the 14th of April that when the time comes for the US military to withdraw, the US government's ability to collect and act on threats will diminish. That's simply a fact. And so with those two specific points on that, from an international security perspective, would you say those comments are real? And therefore, how do you address those the different the challenges posed to the international community?
Well, undoubtedly, there is some truth in what both are saying. That there is a risk that if there aren't Western troops on the ground in Afghanistan, and the Taliban do assume the government in Kabul at some point, whether it's immediately or slightly further down the road, that they will then incubate within Afghanistan some of these terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. On the other hand, I think there is a recognition on the part of the Taliban that if they were to do that, and for terrorist attacks were generated out of Afghanistan against the West, then Western troops would go back into Afghanistan, or there would be at least bombing raids on parts of Afghanistan. So what the Americans have said is that, look, the CT purpose of our involvement in Afghanistan can be continued by other means, from bases maybe in neighboring countries like Pakistan or Central Asian countries, and we can have a standoff counterterrorism operation as required by the circumstances in Afghanistan without having troops on the ground. But you're right to point out that Joe Biden's decision has been taken against his own military and intelligence advice. So I think from my point of view as a security official, I am concerned about the consequences of that, even though I understand the political reasons why the American president is taking this decision.
Yeah, and can I just ask a clarification further on that? You said with regards to some of the security challenges can be met by having bases in nearby countries. You were the High Commissioner to Pakistan. I understand the Pakistanis made it clear that they would not entertain any US base on Pakistani soil, and with regards to in the wider region. So just to clarification, post the withdrawal of NATO troops, is there ability for the United Kingdom, separate from NATO, to be able to keep some troops on the ground, whether it's for training purposes or to assist the Afghan army and security forces, or is it purely that intelligence sharing is what we'll be able to do from a UK perspective post the withdrawal in September?
Well, I think I wouldn't expect the Pakistan government to allow a sort of formal American military base in Pakistan after the withdrawal. but the Americans have operated drones out of Pakistan for many years, and I think that might well continue. I think the Central Asian countries, there probably are possibilities for the Americans to operate as they have done in the past from some of those countries. In terms of the UK, I mean, there is no independent capacity to maintain fighting troops on the ground in Afghanistan. We don't have any fighting troops at the moment. We have training troops, but the force protection for those troops, if you like, is being provided by the Americans. So those troops will withdraw when the Americans withdraw in September. So we will have very few military on the ground at that point. That does not mean that you cannot collect intelligence, that you cannot keep an eye on what is going on and seeing whether there are threats emanating, being prepared, plots being planned out of Afghanistan. That is still possible to do without having troops on the ground, as we do in many other countries. So it's not unrealistic to think that the terrorist threat itself can be mitigated even after troop withdrawal. What I think cannot be mitigated so easily is some of the nation-building democratization ambitions of the Afghanistan mission of several years ago, because we will not have any control over the negotiations between the Taliban and the government. We won't have any control over the system of government that is established after the troops have left. We won't have any ability to influence things like girls' education and democratization and human rights in Afghanistan. So those objectives, which, as we've discussed, weren't the initial objectives of the intervention, but became objectives later on, will not be achieved. But the counter-terrorism objective itself, I think it is realistic to think can be achieved from outside the country.
And can I just clarify the specific point? You mentioned about the nation building in Afghanistan, and that's something which was raised with the Zalmay Khalilzad earlier, more recently with regards to him giving evidence to the US Foreign Relations Committee, and that's with regards to reconciliation in Afghanistan. With regards to, is the institutions in Afghanistan, the judiciary and others, fit enough to ensure that there's fair justice, and also individuals are brought to account both from the Taliban and also from government officials as the country moves forward. And his answer, one of them was, they will have to find as a part of their negotiated settlement an agreement on a process for the future that balance the requirements of justice with the requirements of reconciliation. And my question to you is, looking at Afghanistan, the journey has been for over 20 years. Is it in a position, or are its institutions in a place post-September 2021 to be able to create that unified approach with institutions which are fit for purpose?
Well, it's theoretically possible. I don't myself think it's extremely likely, but you've seen other examples, like in South Africa, where Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and in Rwanda, for instance, after the genocide, there are examples where there has been a successful reconciliation process developed. And Afghans do have a tradition of what's called the lawyer jirga, of leaders of different clans and tribes and families sitting down together and talking things through. I mean, that is a tradition of the region. So it's not impossible that one could hope that that would happen. But equally, I think it's just as likely that there will be renewed fighting, a lot of civilian casualties, and that the Taliban may end up essentially taking over the government in Kabul by force or by pressure.
Yeah, and just a question on that, and this from your time in the United Nations, and the stuff that you oversaw as the High Commissioner in Pakistan, and as a former director at the Foreign Office covering political, is to have a stable country. It needs to be, anywhere around the world, it needs to be inclusive. It needs to be inclusive of all different parts of components of individuals that make up the country. And in Afghanistan, we have a situation where the 2004 constitution recognizes 14 ethnic groups. And just to give an example, you've got Pashtun, Tajik, Hazara, Uzbek, Baloch, Turkmen, to name some. Is there sufficient time from now till September 2021? We're talking about months to ensure that a system that comes in play is able to create a cohesive setup to move forward before, I understand, the president currently in Afghanistan wants to then have a consensus with the lower and the upper jirga and then an election. But my question is there enough time with the peace talks stalled? You have a situation now where months are left before international troops come out. Is there enough time to create this cohesive environment before September?
I think there is the opportunity. As I mentioned earlier, I think the setting a deadline for troop withdrawal will galvanize to some extent the talks between the Taliban and the government. And not everything has to be resolved by September the 11th, but there could be a broad outline of the sort of process towards finding a political settlement in the country. I don't think that's sort of completely unrealistic in that sort of timescale. But it is true that institutions are still fairly weak in Afghanistan. It's a country that's been an independent state for about 100 years and has been formed by internal fighting between the different ethnic groups, more or less, for the entire period of that 100 years. I mean, many countries around the world have different nationalities, different ethnic groups, different tribes, and manage a process which allows it a balance. Kenya, if you like, is an example of that. The difficulty, I think, with Afghanistan, apart from the fact that there is no history of that sort of reconciliation process, is that the Pashtuns, there may be 14 different ethnic groups, but the Pashtuns make up about 50%. There's arguments about whether they're over 50 or under 50, but they are very dominant in terms of numbers. And that makes it more difficult really to accommodate some of the smaller ethnic groups like the Tajiks and Hazaras, etc., that you mentioned. So I think it's not going to be an easy task. But if the political will is there on the part of the Taliban and the Ashraf Ghani government, yes, there is enough time to have an outline of a process that can then continue after the Western troop withdrawal.